Here's a sequence of numbers about life drawing that will make sense, hopefully, by the end of this video. So I haven't gone mad or joined some weird cult or something like that. If someone were to ask me what is the number one principle of life drawing, it would be this. Big and simple to small and sophisticated. The problem is that that's easier said than done. So you might know that simplifying into big gestural curves or simple forms and all of that kind of stuff is important. But then you get into an actual drawing and things start to get tricky. You become unsure, and before you know it, you're adding details hoping that they'll make things look better. And this simplification idea just goes out the window. So if that sounds relatable, we're going to try and deal with that issue today. So my name's Kenzo, and this is Love Life Drawing. So let's make a scale from 5 down to 1, where 5 is the biggest and simplest ideas that you're going to put into your drawing, and 1 is the most detailed and sophisticated ideas. So at level 5, we're talking about big gestural curves that capture the whole pose, really big simple shapes, maybe just a triangle. At level 4, we're talking about capturing big basic characteristics like how the limbs taper down, and also maybe some big planes, some big forms. So like the front plane versus the side plane, the ball of the cranium of the head. At level 3, we might be talking about the asymmetrical curves of the major muscle groups and big simplified shadow shapes. So we're still seeing big and simple relationships, but they're just a little bit more localized. At level 2, we're dividing big planes into smaller planes and starting to bring in a little bit more detail. And then at level 1, we're really defining the smaller forms, the smaller muscles, the fine details within the areas of light and dark. So the actual number sequence that I showed isn't something that you need to memorize or really think about much at all. And even the scale is just something that I'm using to explain the principle. So it's the principle that really matters. So you start from 5, the biggest and simplest ideas, and you slowly move down to 3. But then before getting into any details, you need to go back and revisit your biggest and simplest ideas again, because they're still the priority and you don't want to mess them up when you start to add more details. And then the finer details come really quite late into the process. So let's look at a quick example. This was a painting sketch I did for maybe an hour and a half, just for practice. My first marks in the first few seconds of all of that do a lot of the work. So they're giving me the overall angle of the pose, the sort of S-shaped curve of the pose, the start and end point of the pose. And later on, as I build up this image, I don't want to lose that S shape or this overall angle. So next, I start to build the simple shapes of the pose, but notice I'm still not using many marks. They're mostly straight lines or C-shaped curves. I really want to get in ideas like the tapering of the limbs, the squash and stretch in the torso. Another thing to figure out early is the weight and balance. So in this case, the weight and balance is fairly straightforward because she's sitting on this horizontal plank and leaning her arms on it. So for now, I just need to make sure that I have this plank in place and then plant her hands on it with her arms supporting her weight and then her butt on there as well. This angle across the shoulders is quite important, not just because it's interesting, but also because there's more weight on this arm and that's going to push that shoulder up. And so having that angle kind of helps with the sense of weight and balance. Now I can bring in some forms, but they're really simple. So these two little marks at the knee and around the shin, they're helping explain the forms. The lower leg is receding in space and it's kind of foreshortened, that kind of thing. So now I can add some big shadow shapes, and I'm really just trying to establish the big light areas and the big dark areas. So I started super big and simple and tried to stay as simple as possible as I built things up. But now as I do this, you can see I'm being tempted into some extra information, some extra nuance within my shapes, and that's taking away from how clear my big simple shapes are now. So that's why in that number sequence I had earlier, it goes 5, 4, 3, but then you go back up to 5 because you need to take a step back and make sure your big and simple ideas are still working. They're still the priority. They're still more important than these new details. So there's still no facial features. There's no like differentiating like each toe from each other. There's no details. The only kind of detail I've really put in so far is the belly button, and that's only because it helps mark out the center line, and the center line is really important for explaining how the form is rotated to our eyes. So it's there because it relates to the big picture. You know, we can see a lot on the near side of it and not much on the far side of that center line. So here when I get to the hair, it's still about big shapes, you know, some big dark shapes and then one light shape. I'm not worrying about little details like strands and stuff like that. So as I keep building this sketch, I'm spending as much time fighting to keep it simple and revisiting the big shapes as I am adding any detail or nuance, because the big shapes have to take priority over the little ones. And very often I'll flip the image horizontally to get a fresh look at it, and often I'm like, there's too much detail here, and I kind of wipe it away. So a big part of the problem, for me anyway, is anxiety. So when I'm a bit more nervous, when I'm less confident, I will accelerate down towards details too quickly. For me, this happens a lot with landscapes. Because I'm less confident with them, it's much harder for me to stick to this simplification principle. Even though I understand the principle, I don't have that confidence. So I want it to look, you might relate to these fears. I want it to look like what it is. I want it to look decent, but it doesn't. So I think maybe if I add some characteristic details like the leaves or something, then it's going to start to look like what it is. Having a bit of extra detail is going to make it look more sophisticated, and suddenly I've been tempted away from this simplification idea, and I'm doing loads of details, and accidentally I'm kind of ruining what I'm doing. So I notice this a lot when people are drawing figures. You know, they get drawn into little variations and details thinking it's going to help fix things when it's just going to make them worse. It happens a lot, especially in faces, people getting drawn into little details of the eyes and stuff like that. So how do you fix this issue? It's easier said than done to just be confident and not be worried and get tempted into details. Well, confidence comes from large quantities of practice focused on simplification. So people say you have to practice a lot, and that's true. People also say you need to practice smart, and that's also true. And the simplest way of knowing if you're practicing smart is, are you practicing your simplification skills? So that could be big gestural curves is one type of simplification. Using simple forms like boxes and cylinders and stuff is another. Finding big abstract shapes is another way of simplifying what you're seeing. Are you practicing doing, adding lots of detail and stuff like that? Or are you practicing your simplification skills? Because if you're practicing simplification, you're probably doing smart practice. So, here I might not always be succeeding, but I'm trying to do the right things. I'm not adding tons of detail early. I'm trying to stay on simplicity. In this case, the simplest value structure of the scene that I'm looking at. Good practice doesn't mean that you nail it every time. It doesn't mean that you get it right. I think it's good practice when you're trying to do the right thing, which generally speaking is focusing on some form of simplification. In this case, simplifying into the biggest, simplest value structure. Just before we continue, I wanted to mention that our workshop, How to Draw Figures Beautifully, is available if you want to take your figure drawings to the next level. So you'll learn about an approach that really takes a lot of the complexity and confusion out of life drawing, so you can check that out for free with the link below. So that's why on this channel, almost all of our videos are about simplification ideas. Big gestural curves, big simple shapes, big simple forms and things like that. There's very little on here about detailed rendering and things, because when you're practicing smart, you're practicing simplification most of the time, and we really want to encourage that kind of practice. So there should be some other videos somewhere on the screen, probably related to simplification, so check one of them out, and I'll see you in the next video.